meaning to this book, isn't there? And God comes in. God comes in a lot of different ways. And one of the big questions theologically for all of us in this room, if we take the God issue seriously at all, is where's God when I feel pain? Where's God in the tragedy? Where's God when my daughter is being brutalized? Where's God in the great sadness, the depression, the grief he feels? That's a big question. Where's God? And the author of The Shack, I think one of the intriguing parts of the book for a lot of people is his image of where God is. As readers, as theologians like myself, what do you think? Where do you think his image? Where do you think the author, where Young feels God is in the tragedies of life?
Right in the midst of it.
Right in the midst of them. Yeah. That's interesting, isn't it? Not everyone would agree with you, interestingly enough. You're right about the story, though. But if you look at the one way of looking at Christian theology, and him talking about God for at least 16 centuries, maybe even more, 17 centuries, again, people struggled with the where is God question. Does God experience the world, or is God somewhere else? Does what we have experienced, does it affect God in any way, or is God indifferent to it? Can God change, or is God changeless? Those are all questions that people have wrestled with, right? Young would opt on the side of saying that God experiences our world as our world. That God's in the midst of our world as our world. That God actually feels what you're feeling as your feelings. That God's in the midst of it. Now that's a big deal theologically. For anyone who studied a bit of theology, that's a big deal. Oftentimes, I mean, it's really, that's one side of the story. The other is that God really doesn't feel the world in terms of the feelings of people like us. Christianity has always struggled with this. Christianity has always had, one might say, a Jewish heart and a Greek mind. And when I use the term Greek mind, I don't mean Katsantzakis. I don't mean that. I mean Plato or Aristotle. Now, that's a whole other story for another night. But one of the things that some of the Greek philosophers focused on was the fact that things that don't change are always better than things that do change. Aristotle's understanding of God, which greatly influenced Christianity, and you'll see it in St. Thomas Aquinas, is that God is the one who is thinking God's thoughts. For God to experience something new is for God to be less than what God was. God's perfect and changeless and complete. One way Christians dealt with this, as you brought up Reformed thought, and one of you guys brought up Reformed thought earlier on, was God already knows it in advance, exactly as it's going to happen. Well, that may or may not be the case, that God knows it in advance exactly as it happens, but if God knows it in advance exactly as it happens, then it's God's feelings and not yours. You get my point? God's never experiencing you, God's experiencing God's self, you might say. You provide nothing new to God. You provide nothing of feeling tone to God, if that's the case. I mean, I oppose the notion that God knows the future in advance for one simple reason. It makes God boring. It's perpetual Groundhog Day for God. That God, who knows everything in advance as actual, never has anything new to happen to God, right? Same old God, same old story. Whereas what we think of what's a good life for ourselves is to have new things happen to us, right? Is to be able to do new things. And God, who actually knows everything in advance, can't even do anything new. Get my point? It's already done. Wouldn't your life be rather? There's science fiction movies about the person who knows everything in advance. It ends up being torture. A tortured God. But if God really experiences what's going on in your life as you're feeling, That changes God, doesn't it? That's been a big deal among Christian thinkers. There's a fancy theological term that's often one of these terms to sort of put down somebody's viewpoint. It's called Patripassianism. Has anyone heard that term before? Well, you don't have to hear it again. It's the notion that it's a terrible thing that God would feel the world, that God could never feel the passions of the world. Well, the question is, have you ever prayed for something, and this is that you had a particular intent? This is not confession time here or anything. It's a book talk, but it's important to get in the book room with the book. And then it didn't turn out the way you thought.
That's an answer, but it was no.
Pardon me?
It was an answer, but it was no.
Yeah. Well, what's that about? What's that about? Because most of the time we pray for good things. I don't know if the books here in the bookstore, this bookstore has wonderful books, and, you know, patronize this store as often as you can. But Larry Dawsey, a physician who wrote one of the better books on the prayer studies called Healing Words, also wrote a book entitled Be Careful What You Pray For, in which he noted that some percentage, I'm thinking 5 to 10% of the people, pray that something bad happens to other people. And implicitly we do it too. Implicitly we do it. I mean, I don't pray about football games anymore, I must say, that my particular team wins. But when I pray that the Steelers win, I'm obviously praying that the Cardinals lose. You know, that's the indirect aspect of that prayer. What do we do about unanswered prayer? That's the theme of the book, isn't it? Because he's really praying that his daughter survive, right? That she be safe, that she be okay. Yeah, sometimes the answer, if it's a personal response, seems to be no, doesn't it? At least in terms of our usual awareness. Is his daughter safe? That's the question. What do you think? How do you think the book answers the question? Is his daughter safe?
She is safe.
She is
She
safe.
is safe. She's happy. But she has to go through pain to get there.
But God was with her.
God was with her. Now
Through
that's...
her pain in the truck, because he told
Yeah.
Mac that I was there, and she knew I was there.
I was there. She knew I was there. And then there's that interesting point of power. Did God put her in the trunk? How does Young answer that question? Did God put her in the trunk? It's a big. How you answer that question could be important. And this isn't your final answer, but how you answer the question could be really important. The answer is no. That's a big deal that God didn't put her in the trunk.
Yeah.
Because Young is saying something that's again we had the conversation about Wesleyans and Reformed earlier on, just sitting chatting here. Does God determine everything? If God does, then God put her in the trunk. It's unambiguous, right? Or is there free play in the universe? And free play doesn't mean things have... Oftentimes people, when they use the term free will, mean you can do something without a context. There's absolutely nothing we can do without a context, right? In other words, all free will is shaped by all sorts of factors, including our decision making. God didn't put her in the trunk.
But God got in there with her.
But God got in there with her. As I understand the will of God, at least in the handful of times it's used in the New Testament, and the most common one is the one that you have heard in the Lord's Prayer, right? Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as is in heaven. It's not about power. It's about the world becoming the way God would like it to be. It's about ethics. It's about the kind of ethical God. Is God as good as you are, is the question in a way that Young is asking. Is God as good as you?